Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Michael, and killing generals could be a habit of mine.
And that's right. We're doing the 1967 film, The Dirty Dozen.
And we're doing it for the first time because we had no technical difficulties before this started.
Exactly. And so basically this week we're doing The Dirty Dozen. It's my pick since it's my birthday soon. And
Happy birthday.
so I actually wanted to do an older war movie and something with Charles Bronson. The reason I kind of was leaning this way was because one of my favorite movies is The Great Escape. And that's an awesome old movie, and I wanted to watch something very similar to it to find out what else was out there that meets those kind of expectations. It's really funny because I just looked up The Great Escape again, and Charles Bronson is in that one.
That's
I was
right.
picking a movie with Charles Bronson, and I could have just picked that because it is such a great movie.
I
But-
don't think if you want to do a Charles Bronson movie, I think you pick the better one because he's kind of a wimp in The Great Escape.
Yeah. Now that I remember more clearly, yes.
He's the miner who has claustrophobia.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was a fun character for him, I think, but this one is a lot more badass, so I'm glad I picked this.
Okay, so The Dirty Dozen stars Lee Marvin as Major John Reisman as a disgraced U.S. major who is tasked with taking 12 prisoners on death row or sentenced to years and years and years of hard labor and cobbling them together into a secret military unit that he can then drop into Germany to execute a bunch of high-ranking Nazi officers during a big party. So the movie is all about Lee Marvin, the major, trying to hammer these very big personalities into like a cohesive group that he can then use against the Nazis. So it's a story of war and redemption and brotherhood. And yeah, it's a really, really good time.
Yeah. And this fits into what I've coined as the Misfits on a Mission subgenre, which is a really fun and exciting subgenre of films where it's a bunch of these outlandish characters. It's often on ensemble cast, and whether it be them going and doing a heist movie or whether they're trying to win the league as this group of random people that should have no business in getting to like a sports final or something like that, it kind of fits into that group of movies.
And this is almost a sports movie. Like the war, this is a bit of a spoiler, but not really. Like the war itself only kind of comes into play in the last 40 minutes of this 2 hour and 30-minute movie. Like actually, maybe this is a bit of a spoiler. Blake, you might have to edit this out. But like for me, the most engaging scene was when they play capture the flag against another military unit, which is essentially like a big sports movie ending.
I really liked that scene too, where they basically have to prove themselves because they're gonna get shut down by the legitimate side of the war.
You're getting too
Was
far
like-
into the spoiler territory here.
Yeah, we are.
So let's transition to characters and people you may know, and try not to spoil this movie too much right now in the primer episode.
No deal.
So characters and people you may know. The thing with this movie is that it came out in 1967, and as a part of a critique of the film at the time, a lot of the actors playing soldiers or soldier prisoners are actually a bit older than what they typically would be if they were actually fighting in World War II. And so a lot of them were actually real World War II vets and lived pretty hard lives. And because of that, most of them were not actually around in the last 20 years, with a couple of notable exceptions, actually. And we'll probably talk about one in particular and how, he crops up from time to time again, and how, I don't know about you guys, but I was pretty surprised to actually see him in this movie.
Let's give the viewers at home a hint. Think falling snow, and you might know who we're talking about.
I don't know what you mean.
Okay,
That's a real deep riddle there.
what? Okay, well, I'll save it for the next episode then.
Um,
Bam! Call to action.
Nice. So our first character is Major John Reisman. He's the major charged with putting together this team of ragtag misfits and executing a highly dangerous suicide mission, essentially behind enemy lines right before D-Day happens.
And execute is the operative word here.
Yeah. And he's an extremely charismatic character. He's somebody who is really exciting to follow throughout the movie. And he's played by Lee Marvin, who's a name that I actually hadn't heard of before this film and before watching this movie.
Yeah, this was my first exposure to him as well.
Yeah, same here.
And on that note, like, he's kind of maybe one of my favorite characters of the film, and he kind of holds everything together. And this is a really great performance of his. He's actually known for playing these kind of characters in other films and TV, and so that's why he kind of was typecast in that role, because especially in the 50s and 60s, he was the tough guy or the anti-hero of a lot of TV shows and films, such as some other films that you may have heard of because of other stars that they had in them, like Paint Your Wagon with Clint Eastwood or The Professionals with Burt Lancaster. And he even actually won an Oscar for a Western comedy called Cat Ballou with Jane Fonda as well, who is a very important character or a very important actress to Hollywood.
Yeah.
The other next main character is the general, who's played by Ernest Borgnine. He's the one who kind of puts together this plan to get a bunch of highly what's the word I'm looking for?
Trained?
He's trying to get like a task force together of disposable criminals who they can basically just, force to go on this suicidal mission.
Think the Expendables, but somehow even more expendable.
Yeah.
Yeah, extremely expendable and crazy, destructive, and they're kind of just dangerous. Just dangerous, badass motherfuckers. He's trying to get a group of them to just drop in on Hitler.
What's important to note is that this is essentially a suicide mission. Like,
yeah,
the whole deal is if you complete this mission and survive, you get your sentence pardoned or amended or whatever. But like, the thought of actually getting them into a working unit is kind of a big deal, and the thought of them actually coming home is an even bigger deal. At one point when they're going over their plan, they get to the part when it comes to how they're going to escape, and they're like, yeah, and we'll just improvise from there. It's like they don't even really expect to get that far.
Well, and what's really interesting, too, in the opening part of the film is the colonel doesn't even originally decide to allow that as a deal. Like, he's basically like, we're just going to force these guys who are condemned to death or condemned to hard labor to go and do the suicide mission. And the major is like, they're not going to go for this, right? Like, we have to give them something. Mm-hmm. And especially in light of how the film opens with John having to be witness to a military execution, I think that has not the effect that maybe the colonel was anticipating on him.
Right. And there's a great moment that comes out of that where they're executing a young soldier for murder and robbery or something, and it's really brutal. Like, it's very oppressive and like disquieting, and like it's in a prison, and like all the prisoners are like slamming cups against themselves, and like there's a priest reading prayers, but like at one point the priest very dismissively is like, yeah, he's fine, like to the prisoner. And then in the next scene, when the major's being briefed, he's the only one who actually remembers the soldier's name. Mm-hmm. Like, it's a very brutal experience, but it instantly kind of frames the major as like maybe morally superior to the men around him, if only by a little bit.
I really liked how that also introed the major to us. So we see him watch the execution, and then the first thing he's asked was, how was the execution? And he's like, it was very efficient, like everything went well. And then he's like, no, but what was the impact on you? And then that's what like balanced him. So he's very pragmatic, and it shows that he has a human side, and especially reinforced by like the fact that, like you said, he's the only one who knew the prisoner's name.
Yeah, for sure. And what I should actually say is as well, and I think I just quickly mentioned this, is a lot of these actors actually did serve in World War II and are World War II vets for the U.S. Lee Marvin actually saw combat in the Pacific as a sniper in World War II, which is pretty wild. And he has some comments about this film that we'll talk about in the spoiler territory, and his thoughts on the accuracy of portraying war through this film. And that's not necessarily something that I would say is the focal point of this film either, which you mentioned earlier as well, Mike. But getting back to the character, Sir Ernest Borgnine plays the Colonel. I guess modern audiences are actually going to know him from as the voice of Mermaid Man from SpongeBob.
No way. Really?
Oh my god. That's hilarious.
I thought his voice was kind of familiar, but that is so funny.
Evil!
What a great old man. That's awesome.
No, even in this movie, he's fantastic. Like, he might actually have the best performance in the whole movie, for me anyways.
That's fair. And with an ensemble cast like this, I'm going to argue that I personally had some other favorites. But anyway, so Ernest Borgnine, you may know from there. We also covered him on the film Gattaca, which we did earlier this year. Jason and I did together. He's also Cabby from Escape from New York, one of my personal favorite movies. And he's also was a starring role in the Poseidon Adventure, and I've only seen the remake of that, but I'm really interested in watching the original of that sometime.
I would like to see the original too. And yeah, Escape from New York, that was awesome.
I just want to go home and watch SpongeBob.
So Charles Bronson, the reason why we're here, partially, he plays one of the convicts. His story is actually really interesting, and that's something that I'll say, and maybe we'll talk about in spoilers, is how some of the characters' crimes, when you get into the context of what happened and why they've been condemned or
sentenced,
been sentenced, their crimes might seem a little bit more, validated when context comes into play, right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of makes us able to empathize with some of these characters a little bit more. And that's not saying that some of these characters are all redeemable. There's some very irredeemable characters of the 12.
There's one in particular that we got to talk about at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For sure. And so Charles Bronson plays... What's Charles Bronson's name?
Something Wladislaw or something.
Yeah, Wladislaw.
He's like a son of Polish coal miners or something.
But his father spoke German.
It's Joseph.
And that's why that helped his character quite a bit later on.
That's right.
It's, yes.
Joseph Wladislaw. I may not be saying that last name correctly, but it's something like that.
Yes, and he's kind of the quiet one of the group, the hard-faced, like, no-nonsense kind of part of the gang.
So he's Charles Bronson, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, this is if you picture Charles Bronson, this is the character that you would picture him in, for sure. What other films he's known for? You've already mentioned The Great Escape, Jason. He's also known for The Magnificent Seven and Once Upon a Time in the West. So he was really important during the Western era of films as well.
He's probably best known for the Death Proof series.
Yes, that's also a very important series.
Death Wish, that's right, Death Wish.
Yeah. The next character is Franco. Victor Franco. He's the most unhinged character of everyone. Like, he always is kind of like ready to lose it at any point in time, ready to disobey commands. Very, very interesting performance by John Cassavetes, a name that I had heard but never seen in film before. And John Cassavetes is a really interesting person in Hollywood because he stars in a lot of films at this point in time that are very famous, called like Rosemary's Baby and Love Streams, but he also becomes like a pretty prominent director and an indie director, and I think his films have maybe somewhat, because of the indie nature of them, become more faded into history a little bit, but they're definitely films that I think we should be checking out on this podcast because I think they're the exact niche of underrated films that we're trying to find on this podcast.
I will say that he's another actor who this was my first experience with him, and like watching him like freak out and foam at the mouth, I was kind of like, this guy's a good actor. Like, I'd like to see him in other stuff.
Yeah, he was like an essential part of the 12, I think, because he was like the balance to the other crazy character. So
Yeah.
like kind of like he's like a pure anarchist, but he has like kind of his own rules, like that kind of character, whereas the other crazy character is like off the radar, like he's extra crazy.
One thing I found interesting about Franco was that he's essentially like a mad dog, but like he's sort of the one who brings the group together, whether that's in terms of other characters joining forces to stop him or like advocating on the group's behalf when he's angry about something. Like he's almost kind of one of the most instrumental members of the group, like almost despite himself.
Yeah. And you know what? The other thing I'll say about his actor is like you said, the foaming at the mouth kind of thing, but it was also in the eyes. Like he had this crazy look in his eyes often throughout the film, and it really felt like he could be capable of anything at any time.
Yeah, he's pure like chaotic neutral. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's just for context, his offense was he's been sentenced to death because he killed a local for what amounted to $10 in pocket change. So, and in his first scene, he tries to attack the major. So that kind of tells you everything you need to know about this guy.
Right.
Think
He's
Sonny,
almost like a Joker-esque.
kinda, yeah.
Yes.
I was gonna say like Sonny Corleone, but even more unhinged.
Yeah. More in like Godfather Part 2 than Godfather Part 1.
Sure.
The next character that I'm going to talk about is maybe one of my favorite characters of the film, one of the 12, and his name is Robert T. Jefferson. He's the black member of the group, and because of this time period in America, he is often the one who's targeted by some of the more racist members of the group, and that's also the reason why he's in there, is he was essentially in there for murder, but it was practically self-defense because the guys were trying to lynch the guy. So like, you know, you can kind of, you feel for him as a character, and he kind of grows to become like one of the quiet leaders of the group, which is really fascinated me, and I really loved his performance. And the actor who portrays him is Jim Brown, who is actually one of the greatest football players of all time. And more on that later, because his football career is very much tied to this film and his legacy. But Jim Brown, like, absolute phenomena. He also had films or starring roles in Mars Attacks, The Running Man, which is the adaptation from Richard Bachman's Stephen King, which it's a terrible adaptation, but it's a pretty fun movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Any Given Sunday. And on that note, Jim Brown actually unfortunately passed away about 2 weeks ago.
Right. Yeah. That is unfortunate.
Also, he was good friends with Muhammad Ali, and Muhammad actually came to the set of The Dirty Dozen, and there's a photo, there's like 2 or 3 photos of him on set, just because Jim Brown was such a cool guy and was friends with Muhammad Ali.
Wow.
Yeah, so slightly timely episode that this ended up being, and, you know, a little bit of a tribute to Jim Brown on this one.
Yeah, he crushed it in this movie.
Yeah.
And what a life.
His character was like the silent enforcer, or like loyal enforcer of the group, which like I really liked. Like he was always like the one to knock everyone else into shape if they were acting out.
Well, and he could also spot where, you know, the bullshit was, and be able to identify, like, you know, like maybe we actually have something here, and like maybe this is where we can push the authority and stuff like that. Like I really, really liked his performance. Thought it was one of the highlights of the film.
Yeah.
We're not going to talk about all 12 of the Dirty Dozen here, but the last character that I do want to mention is, actor that I want to mention is Donald Sutherland.
Hey.
Yeah, a Canadian icon, one of the most famous Canadian actors ever, playing Vernon Pinkley. He's kind of the dim-witted member of the group, although he has a very, very comical scene later in the film, which is a highlight of the film for me. if you haven't seen or heard of Donald Sutherland before,
How dare you?
do you guys have any favorites of his that like you've seen him in that you want to mention?
I haven't seen Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but I want to.
Oh yeah.
Yes, that's one we'll definitely be doing on this podcast at some point.
Can I just point out how surreal it is? Because like I've only ever like I know Donald Sutherland as, you know, old man Donald Sutherland, right? Like white hair, big eyes, all that stuff. So like for the first like 40 or 50 minutes of this movie, I kept looking at it and I'm like, who is that guy? Like he looks so familiar. You know who I thought it was for a sec? I was like, is that the cameraman from Groundhog Day? Like, you know, that guy? And then finally at some point it clicked. I'm like, that's fucking Donald Sutherland. Like, so it's weird seeing, it's almost like seeing a picture of your grandpa as a really young man, just being like, oh, hey.
Well, and talk about young here too. Like this is his breakout role. Like this is what gets him MASH later. And it's that very highlight performance scene that I was talking about that we'll talk about in the spoiler episode. That, you know, he absolutely crushes and chews a couple of these scenes up. And the other reason why he's so famous is or his spawn is famous is he's also Kiefer Sutherland's dad, who's
That's
somebody
right.
who, you know, our parents' generation really grew up with or alongside and was really famous. And he's, you know, I guess I don't have to talk too much about Kiefer Sutherland's performances, but yeah, that's a lot of Canadian heritage right there.
That's right.
Yeah, and you've seen Donald Sutherland in things like The Italian Job. He was a voice in Lord of War. There's The Mechanic.
Most recently, The Hunger Games, which is a very famous movie
And
series.
who does he play in The Hunger Games? President Snow. That was my riddle earlier, you idiots.
I'm going to be honest, I don't know if I've ever watched any of the Hunger Game movies. I've read all the books,
really?
but...
He's great as that old man.
Yeah,
Character.
he is pretty good.
So this film is directed by Robert Aldrich, who also directed Emperor of the North and actually The Longest Yard, the original Longest Yard that stars Burt Reynolds, not the remake that stars Adam Sandler with Burt Reynolds. I've actually only seen the remake Longest Yard, which is actually a movie that I remember very fondly from my childhood, and I think that's a sports movie that I'd be really interested in doing on this, and that's again one of those films that fit into my Misfits on a Mission kind of film.
Yeah, we don't really get to see all 12 of the characters in much detail. We see probably about 6 of them where like you actually know who they are and you know their names as you're watching. You
And they
kinda
get
to
character
know them.
development.
Yeah, like they couldn't do it all 12, which is completely fair. But the ones that we do get to see, they're pretty fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I forgot to mention the last most important character of the film, and that's Maggot.
Archer Maggot.
Yes, who's the psychotic rapist murderer of the group, who's in for execution for raping and murdering a poor woman.
He's basically an old-timey Reddit moderator.
But
Oh.
with the psychotic religious twist where he thinks he's doing God's work directly as his tool of like death or like destruction against people who are sinning with women or women who are sinners.
Yeah,
It's like a witch hunter.
It's very like out of all the 12, he's easily the most deranged, which is kind of saying something.
And he acts it well.
Yeah.
Who was the actor for him?
That was
Telly Savalas.
very, very bald actor. He was most famous for roles in the James Bond series. And if you know what's the movie? If you know the Austin Powers series, and what's the bald dude's name?
Dr. Evil?
Dr. Evil. So he like Dr. Evil is like the parody of Tony Savalas' character in the James Bond series. He's like one of James Bond's most famous villains, and I'm blanking on his name right now.
Goldfinger?
No, not
Gold
Goldfinger.
member? I'm not a big James Bond guy. I don't know. But yeah, he looks like a James Bond. He just looks like a villain in general. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Sure, he was a nice guy in real life, but he looks very sinister. Do you remember in the Titanic episode where I said if you have a receding hairline, you have to play the villain? Well, if you're bald, you're really typecast as the bad guy.
So true.
Yeah.
So who is this movie for, and does it hold up for a modern watch? I'm really interested to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I enjoyed this movie quite a lot. I basically knew nothing about this movie going in except for the title and the fact that Charles Bronson was in it.
Yeah.
And I will say it held up pretty well, but it's a bit dated in parts. There's a couple filmmaking techniques that are a little... they look a little slapdash by today's standards. I don't think that diminishes the movie's enjoyment for me, but there were a couple sequences where I was like, oh, really? But... no, I'd say it held up pretty well despite being a little rough around the edges in parts.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like there's maybe the most minor of pacing issues potentially. Like I was never bored, and I was actually very drawn in very quickly to this film. But this is a film that is 2.5 hours long, that does plot along. There is 3 very distinct parts to the film, I think. And if you're not prepared to kind of move through this adventure with these group, then you might find yourself kind of wandering in your thoughts at times. But like I said, I was personally very drawn into this film and very interested in how the Major was going to get everybody in line and working as a team together, and then them pulling off the mission at the end. I wasn't expecting the mission to kind of take such a back seat to the film as well. Like it really, like you said, Mike, doesn't really start until like the last 40 minutes of the film or so.
Yeah, going back to my point, I will say that, like, yeah, the movie is very clearly split into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And actually, I found Act 3 to be the weakest. Like, the actual mission itself is kind of where the movie started. I don't want to say losing me, but that's when my mind started wandering a little bit.
So I won't debate, like, your interest, but I do want to talk about that further when we get into the deep dive, because I do have some thoughts on that and how the build-up of the film worked in favor of the last 40 minutes.
Okay, I will save that complaint for later.
Yeah.
Then for me, I enjoyed the movie overall. I don't think it's as good as The Great Escape. I think it's like close. It's in the same area. So for anybody who likes older war movies like The Great Escape, this definitely like will scratch that itch. And just like you guys, I was like drawn in fairly quick, and it kept me involved enough. It did have that little pacing issue where like I was like, when are things gonna start happening? But like there was always little things happening, which maybe some could have been cut or some could have been like shot better to invoke the emotion that they were going for in a quicker amount of time. I don't think this is like a direct like a modern audience couldn't just jump into it. You have to be a enjoyer of film.
A film enjoyer.
What I'll say, though, is that this film shares a lot of DNA with some really famous movies of the last 10, 15 years. And like I said, I'm going to bring this back to the Misfits on a Mission tag that, you know, the Suicide Squad being the most recent example of this, and how much, like, the Suicide Squad borrows from a film like this.
That was my biggest modern that would have been my biggest modern point of comparison as well.
How are you missing Inglourious Bastards?
Well, that's
also
the other one I was going to bring up.
Yeah.
That's number 2.
That's the big one.
The Inglourious Bastards, especially the third act of this film, you can really feel the direct comparison here, and how brutal it depicts some of the war elements of the film, and how uncaring the group can somewhat be. It's not the right wording exactly that I'm looking for, but
how callous they can be.
Yeah. I would say though that there's the second scene of the Dirty Dozen is like they actually replicated it in Inglourious Bastards, and that's just the intro to all 12 of the inmates. They didn't do it exactly in Inglourious Bastards, but I'm pretty sure they used like the same or a very similar backdrop and the same like lineup of all of the guys.
Yeah, and when we get into the spoiler discussion, I have a pretty interesting discussion about that and how this movie, how we get from point A with The Dirty Dozen to point like C or D with Inglourious Bastards, because there's a very interesting timeline in which those movies are connected. And I'll talk about that later, but we'll come back to that because there's actually a pretty deep connection there. The other films that I would say immediately jumped to my mind when I was watching this were Fury with Brad Pitt, the World War II movie about them in a tank, and Army of the Dead, actually. I kind of thought of as well the
Zack Snyder movie?
Yeah, the Zack Snyder movie. Again, like the Misfits on a Mission kind of idea, and how it's this ragtag team that have been brought together to do something.
Blake, you might be the only person in the world who's seen Army for the Dead.
No, it was actually insanely popular when it came out.
Oh, really? Okay.
I've seen it.
I'm just being a contrarian then. That's fine.
But yeah, like I think it shares a lot of DNA with those kind of films. It's not like a direct war movie. If you're gonna compare to a war movie, I would say slightly Full Metal Jacket, in the sense that like there's the training first half and then the war second half. But
and the crazy bald
different.
guy.
What's that?
And the crazy bald guy.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, that's the secret ingredient.
But though even those films, like there's a lot of nuance to Full Metal Jacket that really differs in what this film is portraying versus that film.
Yeah, and this one, nothing's really very deep. There's a fair amount of cliches, but like it is a product of the times where it was kind of initiating some of these concepts, and some of these cliches only became cliches much later. So some of it was like fairly original. It's not like a mind-blowing film or anything, but it's very enjoyable throughout.
It's very effective at what it does.
Yeah.
Going back to that word again, callous. Callous is a really good word for just the overall vibe and attitude of the film, right? Like, it's not overly concerned with like character depth. It's not overly concerned with like the real honest to God human cost of war. It's just kind of, it's violent and it's pretty straightforward in what it does.
Yeah. So it's like a great, if you're into like Quentin Tarantino films, you're probably going to enjoy this one a lot, because Quentin Tarantino borrows a lot of why this film is such a good popcorn flick. And that's where we'll segue into when to watch. For me, like this is such a good Saturday night, big budget movie to watch even with like a group of people probably. Like I think I would have a lot of fun sitting around watching this with the boys kind of thing, you know?
The boys.
As long as everybody was into movies like we are, like I think it would be tough to get like Kelvin into this.
Mm-hmm. And that's just because of like really the first 10 minutes have like an old-timey feel to it, but like once you really get into the dynamic of the group, like I was like, you know, this movie just kind of like, you know, apart from a few, I was hooked at that point. Like once we got introduced to the group and we saw how everybody worked with and against each other kind of thing, I was fully on board at that point. It just that first 10, 15, 20 minutes, like, you know, it feels like a film of a product of a prior time. However, this film becomes such an important legacy to this genre of films and on a lot of filmmakers, that more contemporary filmmakers of our time.
Here's my recommendation. Watch it on a Saturday night with your dad.
Yeah.
This is a great dad movie.
Yeah.
Father's Day coming up too.
Yeah.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. And not that they reference D-Day in the movie, but D-Day is my birthday, June 6th, and this should be releasing probably 2 days before that, I think, or no, 2 days after. But so it's very timely around that.
This one comes out this week, so the deep dive will come out around your birthday.
Ah, okay,
right.
Perfect.
Yeah. Where to watch? So I actually watched this on YouTube. There's a free version of it on YouTube right now, and it's really good quality actually. So I gotta say, you know, if you could watch it free, why not?
We don't condone piracy, but if it's already up, you may as well just give it a watch.
Yeah, it depends on who put it up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 60-year-old movie almost, and everybody in this film is dead now, so it's not like any of them are benefiting anymore from it.
Almost everybody, but yeah.
Almost everybody. Donald Sutherland, but this is not Donald Sutherland's primary moneymaker anymore.
No, he's got lots of stuff to going on.
And I think that's it for the primer episode, unless there's anything that you guys want to talk about spoiler free.
How do you like the movie poster?
Yeah, it's kind of an old-timey movie poster, but it is kind of neat.
Yeah.
Let me pull it up because I need to take another look.
I feel like Inglourious Bastards kind of replicated it somewhat as well, at least like part of it, but very, very like 1967 war movie. It's and like they had a pretty good tagline: train them, excite them, arm them, then turn them loose on the Nazis.
Yeah, that is kind of badass.
I feel like
Yeah.
just train them, excite them, arm them would have been more effective. You could have lost
Yeah.
that second sentence, but that's just the editor and me.
That's a 60s type of dialogue though.
Yeah, I guess.
All right, well, with that, I think that's it for the episode. The one thing I do want to mention is next week we're actually going to be making picks for the movie draft. We've got that coming up, which I'm really excited about. Going to be doing that in July. So stick around for that in part 2.
Yeah, looking forward to doing our draft.
Yep. It's all happening next week on Vintage Cinema Rewind.
Wind.
Rewind.
Rewind.
If that's gonna be our catchphrase, we might need to workshop it. I don't think we're gonna hit the right metrics with that.